Welcome, everyone, to the keynote talk for our third talk in the three-part series, Wisdom versus Intelligence. We've been waiting many months for this final grand finale of our presentation, and I'm so honored and excited to announce and introduce one of my absolute favorite professors. I've got a collection of them, as you can see, and I've asked them all to please come and teach at Cosmos Institute. The first time I met Daniel is when I was a student at Pacifica Graduate Institute, and he was just kind of minding his own business, walking down the hallway, and I accosted him. I said, "You are the Rilke scholar," and he was very shy. He said, "Yes, yes, I am," and he just kind of shuffled away. And then 6 months later, I finally was taking his Rilke class, and during the residential, I remember I kept following him around like a puppy. I was like, "Please, can you teach me? I want to learn from you. Will you be my mentor?" And he was like, "Go away, kid. I didn't take a," and he was very nice, but it didn't happen then. But I put that in on the back burner, and I always knew that I wanted to work with Daniel in a more consistent fashion because I think of him as a really tremendous scholar and wisdom teacher. So it gives me great pleasure to be working with him now at Cosmos Institute. Daniel has designed the ninefold gnosis pedagogical model that our school's kind of philosophical ethos is based upon. And today he is giving a wonderful talk, and I'll just read his bio for you in case you don't know how awesome he is already. Dr. Daniel Joseph Polikoff has published 7 books of poetry, translation, criticism, and creative nonfiction. A Rilke scholar, who, by the way, he's teaching a class on Rilke in the spring. His writing on the poet includes the innovative biography In the Image of Orpheus, Rilke, A Soul History. He has taught at 3 Waldorf high schools, as well as Sonoma State University and the California Institute of Integral Studies. He is currently an adjunct professor in the Depth and Archetypal Psychology program at Pacifica Graduate Institute, in which he teaches the class The Poetic Basis of Mind, which is the one I took. It's amazing. In the early 1980s, Daniel had the privilege of studying with the philosopher-astrologer Anthony Damiani and later conducted a professional astrology practice under the aegis of Hermes's wand. More recently, he has turned attention back to the subject of his PhD thesis, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and is currently at work on a multi-volume project titled Reset or Renaissance: Life, Liberty, and the Quest for Enlightenment in a Post-COVID World, the second volume of which was just released through Steiner Books. I highly recommend both volumes. Please welcome Dr. Daniel Joseph Polikoff.
Well, thank you, Galilei, and thank both you and Mary for those wonderful talks, and Galilei for all you have done in founding and shepherding Cosmos, which is quite a remarkable feat. I'm going to dive right into this talk, although I will preface it by just a word about Anthony Damiani, because the talk somewhat doubles as a bit of an introduction to Astronoesis, which is Anthony Damiani's work on philosophical astrology. And as was briefly mentioned, I did study with Anthony at Wisdom's Goldenrod Center for Philosophic Studies in the early 80s when I was doing my graduate work at Cornell University. So I do have a personal acquaintance with the background of this work. Anthony was a remarkable man who, by his own report, discovered God when listening to Schubert as a teenager, and whose own teacher at a certain point, or mentor, was Paul Brunton, whom some of you may be aware of, one of the very first teachers to bring Eastern wisdom, yoga, and meditation, all the things we are very familiar with today, but not at that time, to the West. He was familiarly called PB in wisdom goldenrod circles. And so the study there really centered around these two pretty remarkable, sagacious individuals, although PB was no longer with us in person, but his works were Anthony Damiani and Paul Brunton. So with that, I'm going to jump into the talk. It will be about an hour. I hope it holds your interest. It's called Apocalypse Indeed: Artificial Intelligence versus Archetypal Ideation, Introducing Astronoesis. Last year, at this same special moment, the solstice that marks the turning of the year from darkness towards the light, I concluded my talk on Sophianic pedagogy by alluding to a term evoking no invisible pivot foreshadowing a gradual accession of the light, but sudden and dramatic transfiguration. Yet even if apocalypse means, literally, a tearing of the veil, and so, as in that other familiar biblical moniker, revelation, the resonance of the word is by no means unambiguously positive. While some enthusiasts may conceive of the end of the world as an occasion for religious rapture, most of us are, if not exactly content with our earthly lot, nonetheless rather attached to it, and associate apocalypse with utter and total catastrophe. Rather than a glorious light-filled embrace of Godhead, we envision, as per some good and many awful films, the wreckage of cities, the incineration of nature, and human, if not planetary, extinction. It is thanks largely to AI that today such images represent frighteningly real possibilities. In his deeply insightful book, Jung versus Borg, Glenn Slater both acknowledges this fact and makes a further, more subtle point. If it is plausible to foresee the literal end of humanity in the not so distant future, we need also recognize that such an end, by which term I here mean intended goal, as well as point of termination, is already with us, here, now, and potently so in mainstream culture. The idea of the end of humanity comprises the gist of post or transhumanism, the ideological current that underwrites the human race's risky, some might say mad, AI experiment. Listen to this recent exchange between writer and podcaster Ross Douthat and his guest, Peter Thiel, the PayPal founding billionaire whom, as mentioned too in my prior talk, is no stranger to the topic of apocalypse. Their conversation revolves around the loaded question of the future of humanity.
I think you would prefer the human race to endure, right? You're hesitating.
Yeah, well,
yes.
I don't know. I would.
This is a long hesitation. This is a long hesitation.
There's so many questions implicit
Should
in this.
the human race survive?
Yes.
Okay.
But I also would I also would like us to radically solve these problems.
Right.
And so it's always, I don't know, transhumanism is this, the ideal was this radical transformation where your human natural body gets transformed into an immortal body.
There you go. There it is. As I discuss in the chapter Transhumanism 2020, The Cross and the Machine, in my latest book, Apocalypse of the Modern Mind. The philosophy in question here has a long pedigree, dating back to the 1957 article by Aldous Huxley titled simply Transhumanism. Other landmarks include Max Moore's 1990 essay, Transhumanism Towards a Futurist Philosophy, the piece that decisively tied transhumanist aims to the radical alteration in the nature and possibilities of our lives resulting from various sciences and technologies, as well as Nick Bostrom and David Pearce's founding of the World Transhumanist Association in 1998. Transhumanism itself, the core idea, is thus nothing new. What is new are the technological advances culminating in diverse applications of AI that make implementation of transhumanist influence initiatives an increasingly ubiquitous fact of light. To cite an example pertinent to the sphere of higher education, I spoke a few days ago to a friend whose daughter is a distinguished scholar of Black geographies and indigeneity at the University of North Carolina. My friend reported that UNC's current policy effectively requires professors to use AI in their courses and aid their students in employing the tool for their coursework. In Jung versus Borg, Glenn Slater presciently analyzes the psychological consequences of the nascent AI revolution, the inestimable human costs attached to our STEM-dominated culture's newest, shiniest, most powerful boy toy. The proponents of what WEF, World Economic Forum, founder Klaus Schwab calls the fourth industrial revolution. The third was the computer revolution. The fourth involves various advances culminating in AI. Don't focus at all on the downsides Slater sets in such disturbing relief. The disassociation, fragmentation, and anesthetization of the human soul. Instead, Schwab and younger FIR, Fourth Industrial Revolution, trailblazers tout its inestimable benefit to humanity at large, welcoming and presenting as inevitable far-reaching changes in our way of life and being, changes that, even short of the going full cyborg envisioned by Thiel, decisively transform, and here I quote Schwab, what it means to be human. Those changes, Slater argues, are generally very much for the worse, tending less toward post-humanist utopias than dysfunctional and destructive forms of inhumanity. The second volume of my opus, Reset or Renaissance, unfolds a kindred argument while focusing more on the sociopolitical than the psychological dimensions of our perilous situation. Apocalypse of the Modern Mind, COVID and the Dialectic of Enlightenment, unfolds the historic developments commencing with the dawn of modernity and the rise of science, which, manifesting the shadow side of the genuinely liberatory Enlightenment impulse, readily lead to the authoritarian forms of technocratic governments intrinsically allied to the post-humanist agenda. In his book, Slater draws upon Jung to articulate a coherent alternative to transhumanist ideology, a countercultural initiative that preserves and fosters what Slater calls the deeply human. In this vision, the wholeness and authenticity of our being depends upon rootedness in natural instinct rather than enslavement to the machinery of manufactured desire, memory of the deep past, of cultural tradition, rather than commitment to a future dismissive and forgetful of all ancestry, and conscious reconnection to the universal principles inscribed in the archetypal dimension of the human psyche, instead of obsession with the latest TikTok post or most recent iteration of ChatGPT. In his talk, Kieran Legris echoes many of Slater's themes, but his focus on archetypal astrology adds another highly significant element to our picture of the human being, one especially pertinent to the Kosmos Institute. The discipline of astrology takes its point of departure from the world of the stars and planetary spheres, the objective cosmos out there in nature, as opposed to the subjective cosmos internal to the human soul. Astrology, however, distinguishes itself from astronomy insofar as astrology does not exclude the latter. On the contrary, the science of astrology presupposes meaningful correspondence between above and below, outer and inner worlds, cosmos and psyche. The insights astrology may offer regarding, for instance, the present Saturn-Neptune conjunction can be deeply meaningful and contribute to the kind of archetypal understanding that grounds Slater's deeply human. Such astrological inquiry may also elevate the mind as we contemplate the unfolding of a type of wisdom that, sourced in the enduring realm of the stars and orderly motion of the planets, clearly transcends the mortal sphere. Indeed, one may well regard the significance of any particular constellation to be dwarfed by the sublime mystery implicit in the foundational enigma of astrology itself, the synchronicity linking the human soul and the cosmic intelligence of nature, the music of the spheres, so intimately that the famous lines of the poet Yeats can be aptly invoked. O body swayed to music, O brightening glance, how can we know the dancer from the dance? Let's pause for a moment to dwell upon the implication of this awe-inspiring synergy. In his path-breaking Cosmos and Psyche, Richard Tarnas presents compelling evidence of determinate correlations between specific planetary configurations and human affairs, those major social or political movements, scientific breakthroughs, or artistic masterworks that manifest salient developments in human consciousness and culture. The cycle of hard aspects between Uranus and Pluto, for instance, correlate with what Tarnas calls epochs of revolution, including events associated with the scientific and French revolutions and the upheaval of the 1960s. Yet, as scientists, especially vaccinologists, like to say, correlation does not prove causation. Indeed, philosophically speaking, correlation is a very unassuming term. In the context of the Hermetic tradition that supplies the philosophic grammar of astrology, the operative notion is generally not correlation, but correspondence. That word implies no coincidence that could conceivably be accidental, but intrinsic linkage, even indissoluble bond, like that between the dancer and the dance. As noted, transhumanism is not exactly a new idea. Even so, the philosophy it represents is positively neophytic in comparison with the Hermetic tradition, taking its legendary point of departure from the quasi-mythic Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistus, and so dating back not decades, but thousands of years. Hermeticism finds substantive, formative expression in the landmark 2nd or 3rd century collection of texts called the Corpus Hermeticum. Far more cryptic than the Corpus Hermeticum is that famous quintessence of Hermeticism, the Emerald Tablet, oft regarded as the basis of medieval alchemy and source of the familiar saying, "That which is above is like that which is below, and that which is below is like that which is above." The influence of Hermeticism extends well beyond its ancient and medieval manifestations, and in fact played no small role in catalyzing the Renaissance. In 1463, Cosimo de' Medici had charged Marsilio Ficino with the task of translating Plato and other seminal texts recently delivered from Arabic lands. When, however, the Corpus Hermeticum came into Cosimo's hands by way of the scholar Platon, the aging de' Medici, facing the imminent prospect of death, instructed Ficino to put Plato aside in favor of a text thought to be of still more ancient vintage. Ficino himself, hardly your orthodox priest, revered the line of what he called the Prisci Theologiae, the first theologians, a sequence of 6 sages that, while concluding with Plato and including the likes of Orpheus, Pythagoras, and sometimes Zarathustra, begins with none other than Hermes Trismegistus. All are responsible for what Ficino called the Priscia Theologica, or first theology, the original articulation of that perennial philosophy that constitutes the epitome of human wisdom regarding the nature of all things. In marked contrast to the futurist inclinations of transhumanism, Renaissance philosophers regarded the antiquity of a text as a mark of authority. The more ancient, the more sagacious and revelatory the work was supposed to be. No wonder, then, the Corpus Hermeticum made such an impression on Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, and other members of the advance guard of the Renaissance. Given its essential premises, it is no wonder either that the Hermetic tradition, as effectively rediscovered and refounded in the Renaissance, many others, including Giordano Bruno, followed Ficino and Pico in due course, qualifies as the philosophical ground of modern astrology. As such, dates back to the resurgence of the science of the stars enjoyed in the Renaissance period. Hermeticism, one of the defining streams of what today is called Western esotericism, could not, however, thrive in an intellectual climate increasingly characterized by the splitting apart of spirit and matter, God and nature, science and religion. Hermeticism accordingly suffered severe occlusion during the late 17th and 18th century period that marked the heyday of the Enlightenment. Yet the genius of the tradition could not be permanently suppressed. Hermeticism reemerged in force, if significantly transformed, in the creative imagination of those romantic philosophers and poets who reacted against the sterile rationalism and sense-bound empiricism characteristic of the less illustrious heirs of Descartes, Bacon, and Newton, and the mechanistic philosophy that gradually came to define the strictures of what is still commonly known as science today. Among those romantic rebels, and indeed perhaps the most quintessentially hermetic of all, we can name America's own iconic philosopher, Ralph Waldo Emerson. It is no accident that correspondence qualifies as one of Emerson's favorite words, one that peppers his speculative thinking. Emerson's early groundbreaking work, the little book Nature, a positively apocalyptic text called by Oliver Wendell Holmes the Book of Revelation of our own Saint Rodolphus, revolves almost entirely around the theme of how visible nature mirrors and manifests truths of the mind. That same fundamental tenet anchors, too, the Emersonian manifesto most relevant to the domain of higher education, the landmark 1837 address delivered, where else, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The following metaphysically packed passage keys Emerson's classic description of the vocation of the American scholar. Nature is the opposite of the soul, answering to it part for part. One is seal and one is print. Its beauty is the beauty of his own mind. Its laws are the laws of his own mind. Nature then becomes to him the measure of his attainments. So much of nature as he is ignorant of, so much of his own mind does he not yet possess. And, in fine, the ancient precept, know thyself, and the modern precept, study nature, become, at last, one maxim. Emerson's words bear vast implications for, echoing Schwab again, what it means to be human. Those implications, I would submit, exceed the limits of any Jungian-influenced notion of the deeply human, not because they are incommensurate with the insights of Jungian or archetypal psychology, but because they derive from a universe of thought that takes the metaphysical register of the mind seriously in its own right. This C.G. Jung, whose philosophical standpoint could be roughly described as neo-Kantian, does not do. This acknowledgement need not be understood as any undue criticism of Jung. Working within the milieu of a modern, increasingly individualized consciousness, Jung accomplished an unprecedented revelation of the vast terrain of the psyche. His contribution to the spiritual evolution of humanity is immense. Yet the giants of culture are defined as much by the limits that enable their work, as well as the new expanses they open. It is implausible to imagine that Jung could have fulfilled his own unique destiny if he had, like Hegel or Emerson before him, adopted the stance of a philosophical idealist. That said, we stand today with Jung at our backs, It is now not only possible, but urgent that some scholars not continue to draw the epistemological line where Jung himself drew it, but recognize that it may now be possible to rediscover the heights as well as the depths of human consciousness. Such a move is imperative if we are ever more fully to understand not only a transcendentalist philosopher such as Emerson, and so a central pillar of the American heritage, but concomitantly what the art and science of astrology can tell us about who and what we as human beings really are. That naturally includes what astrology conveys about the nature and full extent of not artificial, but human intelligence, the true reach of the human mind. And so a fundamental, essentially spiritual dimension of the self or soul, capital S in both cases, who I really am. Philosophical idealism in the West, including both its German idealist and American transcendentalist varieties, stems from Plato and Plotinus. The very term idealism alludes to the truth that founds Platonism, the understanding that, above and beyond the manifestly mutable sensible world, there exists subspecies aeternitatis, an intelligible realm of ideal forms that constitutes the ultimate ground of all true being, and thereby functions as the origin of all authentic existence and ontic or individual identity. The physical horse we see grazing in pasture will soon die and decay, but the ideal form that supplies horseness in the first place endures, transcending any particular temporal manifestation. As the Greek ancestry of the word indicates, it is the Platonic tradition that qualifies as the source of the very idea of an archetype. Arche itself means source or origin, as in the famous phrase that begins the Gospel of John, en arche en ho logos, in the beginning was the Word. Type derives from the kindred Greek word typos. Archetype just denotes the first of the type or kind, the original pattern found in and followed by all particular instances. It should be clear enough that this original form cannot be native to the ever-changing realm of diverse things comprising the sensible world, but is itself inherently and necessarily ideal, native to the intelligible realm of forms that Plato calls simply nous, or mind. Correlatively, Platonism endorses, from the get-go, a brand of philosophical dualism, positing a distinct and irreducible difference in kind between the intelligible and the sensible worlds, mind, nous, and matter. This dualism is, however, notoriously unstable, for its very positing provokes the crucial questions as to the nature of the relationship between the two realms, as Daniela alluded to earlier. Just how exactly is any ideal form related to any real thing that supposedly participates in that form? How is the ontological gap between mind and matter, spirit and sense, being and seeming bridged, if indeed it ever truly is? Influential strands of Platonic thought, intimately related to the otherworldly inclinations of ancient Vedic philosophy on the one hand, and medieval Augustinian-influenced Christianity on the other, disbelieves in any substantial bridge between the worlds, deeming earthly life irredeemable maya or illusion, or casting it as a mere way station on the path to the only reality that truly matters, eternal rest with God in heaven. The philosophical conundrum of the relation between mind and matter is no merely academic question. In one consequential application, it bears directly upon the effective means by which any ethical ideal, liberty, say, or justice, may or may not find expression in the practical realm, in the concrete forms of social praxis. Modern man, however, has chosen not to continue to seek an answer to this most fundamental of philosophical questions, but largely to ignore it. In our contemporary culture, science and technology, twin heads stuck in the epistemological sand, pretend to know and tell the nature of reality, the nature of things at large, and thereby provide guidance that can lead us intelligently on towards some brave new world. As a matter of fact, however, what is called science today has utterly failed to solve the dualist's dilemma, one, if anything, more starkly troubling in its modern Cartesian variation. Science's own materialistic premises constitute no answer to the puzzle, but an obfuscation and finally, intellectually and ethically crippling forgetting of it. How is it, after all, that the behavior of matter is supposedly explained by the operation of what are called scientific laws, even while the efficacious force of those laws is supposed to derive entirely and exclusively from a purely material nature possessed of no intelligence that might plausibly lend it causative power? Are scientific laws the cause of the behavior of matter? Or is the behavior of matter the source of scientific law? One cannot have it both ways and pretend to be thinking as a rational being, one who stands upon a sound intellectual footing as he acts in and upon the world. An American heir of Emerson states the gist of the problem succinctly. We see a situation today where the intelligibility of scientific laws is subsumed under and reduced to the same level as the material phenomena that those laws are meant to explain. Anthony Damiani is that rarest of contemporary specimens today, a true Platonist, and the query prompted by his devoted recollection of philosophical tradition echoes unanswered down the halls of science history. It is true that, while science stands oblivious to the paradox that renders its materialistic worldview intellectually untenable, its own philosophical offspring, transhumanism, links hands with technology to offer a kind of practical solution to the mind-matter dilemma. A depth psychological perspective, however, readily recognizes this solution as an unconscious response to the effective negation of mind and spirit, or rather, mind as spirit, implicit in the modern scientific worldview. That worldview conceives of nature as a whole, including the human being, as dead, unintelligent matter, thoroughly devoid of anything one could call soul or spirit. This leaves the human psyche, which intrinsically thirsts for the sense of meaning, purpose, and authentic existence conferred by spirit, in a desperate situation, constitutionally prone to depression, dysfunction, and despair. What then is technology's therapeutic remedy? Employ the modern scientific intellect to build machines that makes matter, in fact, intelligent, endows it with all the attributes of spirit denied to nature, including human nature, by the scientific mode of thought. In other words, AI and transhumanist cyborgs. This solution, this technological resurrection of the matter modern science had pronounced dead, is only conceivable in the mind of a humankind that has utterly lost sight of the originally and irreducibly spiritual source of intelligence and being as nous, or divine mind, and no longer has any conception of reason as the life that flows from that mind, bearing the cosmic ordering power of Logos, or divine word, which is very much what Guillory was speaking about in her talk. I have said that Anthony Damiani is a Platonist. More precisely, and by his own confession, he is a Neoplatonian. In any event, his vision of astrology, as transcribed in his magnum opus, Astronoesis, is first and last of all dedicated to a recalling of what Emerson, who Damiani recognizes as a forebearer, and whose star chart is the only one other than Damiani's that appears in Astronoesis, calls the holiness of the intellect, the awe-inspiring majesty of mind in its original and archetypal form as the Platonic nous. Damiani begins Astronoesis with a prelude that, kin to a bardic poet's invocation of the muse at the beginning of an epic work, recognizes and honors the divine power that must bless the work if it is to reach its aim. The sublime majesty of truth's presence in the sacred sermons of so many wise ones, those of goodwill, ultimately guides us to the ways of peace and wisdom, the lovely, the holy. And so our troubled hearts are reassured, and we can read and reread about God's word in many scriptures. However incomprehensible, a faith settles into our hearts that awakens the desire to understand infinity and forever. The dedication is eternal and to the eternal, for the word becomes flesh. And this is an eternal utterance, an act that includes the human heart mounted on a towering aspiration. Yet even this pyramiding love is without effect unless winged with his grace. So we shall let fly our supplications, enfolded in holy silence on wings of veneration, to the throne of our most sovereign good, with the request to guide the spirit of our understanding, wherein we stand within his light, in order to see the pouring out of the sacred word made manifest. I could almost end this talk with this citation. Damiani's cast of mind, its grandeur and majesty matched only by the depth of reverence, which alone legitimates his nigh limitless ambition, contrasts so starkly, so dramatically with the hubris that saturates the AI transhumanist agenda that one can hardly believe that the human beings responsible for the one and the other belong to the same species. Indeed, that is precisely the deliberate point of the transhumanist project, to transmogrify ourselves into forms of superintelligence that need not recognize, honor, or bow to any higher, more sovereign power. For we ourselves, our futurist cyborg selves, are to become the functional equivalent of divine mind itself, possessed of its characteristic attributes of omniscience, omnipotence, and, of course, alatil, immortality. Our rich literary tradition paints many graphic pictures of how such luciferic hubris is likely to play out. One might think, for instance, of the classic dramas that revolve around the hero's tragic flaw, most notably, perhaps, Oedipus, whose intellectual cleverness, in his book Wisdom of the Ancients, Francis Bacon casts Oedipus as the type of the heroic problem-solving scientist, enables Oedipus to solve the riddle of the Sphinx, but whose intellectual pride and utter lack of self-knowledge, Oedipus is ignorant even of his own parentage, blinds him, preventing him from seeing that it is his own violent past that is the source of the plague afflicting Thebes. Another relevant context would be the end that awaits that portion of humanity leagued with the 2 or 10-horned beast in the book of Revelation, the apocalypse of John. I won't cite that text here, but suffice it to say that as far as gruesome annihilation is concerned, modern dystopic films have nothing on the Bible. Speaking of John, it is noteworthy that, while explicitly Christian or biblical references are few and far between in the main text of Astronoesis, the invocatory prelude does employ several at the outset. Immediately following the opening I just shared, Damiani cites 2 sermons from Eckhart, the second of which, commencing with a quotation from Jeremiah, reads, "The Lord says, stand in the gate of God's house and proclaim his word, extol his word." The Heavenly Father speaks one word, and that he speaks eternally, and in this word expends he all his might. His entire God nature he utters in this word, and the whole of creatures. This word lies hidden in the soul, unnoticed and beyond our ken. And were it not for rumors in the ground of hearing, we should never heed it. But all sounds and voices have to cease, and silence, perfect stillness, reign. This is a meaning I will not pursue. That's Eckhart, and here's Damiani. In this relatively short compass, Eckhart indicates an overwhelmingly vast revelation which has preoccupied the human intellect despite all the historic differences in the spirit of any age, one to which any number of sacred discourses can testify. Among its many formulations, we find Plato's idea of the good, John's The Word Made Flesh, the conception of the Father in the Chaldean sacred oracles, and the sacred syllable pranava om of the Hindus. We intend to pursue meanings that Eckhart did not elaborate. Damiani here displays a breathtaking intellectual and spiritual ambition, openly daring to probe the most holy and hidden secret of the universe, the very nature and origin of the sacred word, the Logos, that is itself Alpha and Omega, the origin of all things. Note, too, Damiani's allusion to multiple wisdom streams, implying that, despite his own primary commitment to the philosophy of Plato and Plotinus, the idea of the good is another way of describing the Platonic nous, other traditions, too, must be drawn upon if any success is to be had in attaining knowledge of the desired magnitude and depth. In fact, the text of Astronoesis perpetually weaves Platonic argument with diverse spiritual strands, most frequently Hindu and Buddhist teachings, but others as well, including Hermeticism and Kabbalah, and, on the modern end, Jungian psychology. In this respect, Damiani's Astronoesis, his attempt to discover and disclose the mystery wisdom hidden like a lotus or pearl of great price at the heart of the astrological mandala, reveals its deep kinship with the Renaissance forerunners of modern astrology. His resort in his quest to the vision of the ancient sages recalls Ficino's reverence for and reliance upon the line of Prisci Theologiae. Correlatively, Damiani's deliberate and painstaking attempt to conceive a comprehensive philosophic vision that contains and combines wisdom from multiple esoteric sources reflects the ambitious, syncretic spirit of Pico della Mirandola, whose precocious and capacious mind sought to synthesize insights from Plato and Aristotle, the Chaldean oracles, the Bible, Kabbalah, the Corpus Hermeticum, and more. Because of what some construed as elements of heresy, surprise, woven into his signature 900 Theses, Pico was never afforded the chance to defend them as he had intended. Pico had sent out invitations to most of leading European intellectuals in an audience before the Pope. Astrology's most metaphysically able advocate, Anthony Damiani, has set down his remarkable theses, but did not live to defend them in the court of popular religious or scientific opinion. I aim, in due course, to do just that, and you may consider this talk an invitation to future disputation. Despite the deeply reverential character of Damiani's preface, I cannot guarantee that those attached to orthodoxy of one or another kind, be that scientific, religious, or psychological, will not find heretical elements in Damiani's Astronoesis and my elaboration of it. Has not the voice of the Spirit, whether sounding the solar music of the spheres or the grace notes of mystic revelation, often been met by closed ears and angry condemnation? My intent in interpreting Damiani is, moreover, a double one. For in that reading and writing, like the heat and light of wildfire, these two are one, I aim to answer, too, the apocalyptic summons Damiani's predecessor, Ralph Waldo Emerson, issued in the opening paragraphs of Nature. Our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers. It writes biographies, histories, criticism. The foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face, we through their eyes. Why should not we also enjoy an original relation to the universe? Why should not we have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition, and a religion by revelation to us, not the history of theirs? Embosomed for a season in nature, whose floods of life stream around and through us, and invite us by the powers they supply to action proportioned to nature, why should we grope among the dry bones of the past, or put the living generation into masquerade out of its faded wardrobe? The sun shines today also. There is more wool and flax in the fields. There are new lands, new men, new thoughts. Let us demand our own works and laws and worship. Our transhumanist champions will no doubt maintain that AI hardly builds the sepulchres of the fathers, but rather strikes out, as Emerson so eloquently urges, toward an entirely new, original relation to the universe. What neither Emerson nor AI openly acknowledge, however, is that such original relation, if it is to be constructive rather than catastrophic, necessarily cooperates with, as per Slater, deep cultural memory and historic recollection. In the absence of such sustaining ground, humanity's flight into the future is likely to resemble a rocket burst into apocalyptic flame. As Ficino and Pico, heralds of the genuinely original Renaissance, knew well, creative rebirth of the world goes hand in glove with devoted memory of ancient ways. Astrology is the most venerable and ancient of the sciences. Regarding the way astrology may serve as a path towards wisdom, Sophia, Queen of Heaven, let me cite another sentence from Damiani. After the previously quoted passage criticizing science for confusing the levels of fact and law, Damiani continues, astrologers and astronomers of today, both alike, Plato would say, fail to use their understanding as a springboard into the higher realms of being. Jungian-based archetypal astrology represents one step in that right direction. Even so, we need a revisioning of not only psychology, but of philosophy, if we are to explore the heights as well as the depths of our human being, and so build a counterculture powerful enough to resist the torrential current of postmodern technocracy. Damiani subtitles Astronoesis, Philosophy's Empirical Context, Astrology's Transcendental Ground. The mutual revisioning of philosophy and the science of astrology is at the heart of his revelatory vision of human intelligence elevated, as of old, to the level of logos, divine word. I've quoted Damiani citing Eckhart, but would be amiss if I did not include, too, words from the principal source of Damiani's opus. I thus cite here a pair of quotations. The first from Plotinus, note the reference to the archetype, the second from Damiani. These quotations provide a window onto the way Damiani proposes to see the world of sense through the lens of a Neoplatonian vision of astrology. First, Plotinus from the fifth Aeneid. Admiring the world of sense, as we look out upon its vastness and beauty and the order of its eternal march, thinking of the gods within it, seen and hidden, and the celestial spirits and all the life of animal and plant, let us mount to its archetype, to the yet more authentic sphere. There we are to contemplate all things as members of the intellectual, eternal in their own right, vested with a self-springing consciousness and life, and presiding over all these, the unsoiled intelligence and the unapproachable wisdom. Damiani. The astrological mandala provides us with the multiple levels of symbolism that will help to make explicit many meanings that are hidden in the Neoplatonic tradition as a whole, most specifically in the Aeneids of Plotinus. This diagram will allow us to juxtapose philosophy and astrology in such a way as to reveal that the sensible universe with its starry host is the primordial living scripture that embodies the wisdom of primal principles, principles that are as far beyond it as the heavens are beyond the earth, and that the basis of astrology is an acquaintance with the wisdom knowledge that sustains the cosmos. Implicit in this grand project is the sketch of a response to that most vexing of questions, the relation between mind and matter, spirit and nature, the intelligible and sensible worlds. In his exposition of what he calls cosmic epistemology, Damiani draws upon Plato's divided line to delineate four levels of being and knowing intrinsic to the soul as it traverses the path from nous, the intelligible realm, to nature, the sensible sphere. And I should add, vice versa. In the returning motion, I will venture to say that I do not think that either Plato or Damiani get quite to the bottom of the matter. Nonetheless, I believe that task can be accomplished by supplementing Plato and Plotinus, not only with insights from Vedanta, Buddhism, and Kabbalah, but with more liberal use of the foundational texts of the Hermetic tradition. The Corpus Hermeticum, after all, combines wisdom from the first and last of Ficino's Prisci Theologi, Hermes and Plato. Composed in the 2nd or 3rd century AD, the Hermeticum is in itself a syncretic text, blending Greek philosophical, Egyptian, and Hebrew Christian sources. The Platonic impression is particularly strong, as epitomized in the very title of the 11th discourse, Nous to Hermes. At the same time, as befits the god of translation and transmutation, Hermetic philosophy offers a more balanced treatment of mind and matter, repudiating the doctrine of the strict ontological and valuative priority accorded to the intelligible realm in Platonic orthodoxy. All of the esoteric exploration I merely hint at here is essential to the interpretation of astrology inscribed in Astronoesis. Astronoesis correlates, and this qualifies as a central feature of its exposition, different features of the astrological chart. The zodiacal constellations, the trans-Saturnian planets, the transiting Chaldean planets, and the earthbound natal chart, with the different levels of Plato's line. Damiani thus undertakes a task Jungian-based astrology, leaning into the concept of the multidimensionality of the archetypes, which of course is valid in its own right, has declined to perform, namely rigorous differentiation of the distinct levels of archetypal intelligence, psychological, mythological, philosophical, implicit in the astrological mandala. This discrimination, in turn, proves crucial to the interpretation of a problem associated with the mind-matter dilemma, namely the relation between our embodied ego and the higher or greater I am principle Jung calls the self, and Damiani over-self. This riddle is every bit as difficult as the mind-matter conundrum, and psychologically more urgent as it bears directly on our vision of the nature of human being, what Plotinus himself calls the authentic human principle. Mention of the over-self points toward a further salient facet of Damiani's life and work. Damiani studied and pursued his quest under the guidance of another spiritual teacher, one whose path led, outwardly as well as inwardly, to ancient sources of wisdom, to searches in, and here I allude to the title of two of his books, Secret Egypt and Secret India. Paul Brunton, born 1898, was one of the first to bring meditation and yoga to the West. For him, spanning the distance between East and West went hand in glove with another kindred act of bridge work, evolving a philosophy that reflected the confluence of ancient wisdom and a thoroughly modern, highly original relation to the universe. Paul Brunton, like Anthony Damiani, was a great admirer of Emerson, whom he considered a true sage. Is it accidental that Brunton, and subsequently Damiani, christens his teaching of an integral synthesis of metaphysical thinking, mystical feeling, and right action, a philosophy of insight? I have in this talk sought to provide an introduction to Astronoesis respectful of the daimon, of the spirit that infuses the book. The real work remains ahead, all the hermeneutic travail, full, like any birth, of pain and of joy, that might allow us, finally, to make sense of Damiani's text, and so solve the riddle of astrology. That might, in turn, empower us to know what Emerson means when he asserts that the laws of nature and the laws of the soul are one and the same. Understand, in the temple of our own higher mind, just how the ancient precept, know thyself, and the modern precept, study nature, become at last one maxim. That kind of enlightened consciousness represents a goal, an aim radically different from that envisioned by transhumanism. The current brand of our AI-influenced postmodern philosophy begins not with love and hope, but defeat and despair. Transhumanism marshals its legions under a white flag, for its first step is to give up on humanity. Transhumanism does not believe capacities inherent in the human mind and soul can match those that can be built into robotic machines, overlooking that the difference in intelligence is not a matter of degree, but kind. It does not believe that the human soul possesses illimitable resources which we, heirs of Plato and Plotinus, Ficino and Pico, Michelangelo and Raphael, have barely tapped. It does not believe that humanity, as our Renaissance, European and American, forebearers so splendidly display, is thus at the beginning rather than the end of its line. It does not believe that the horizon of the future lies not in some outer or virtual space, but within the sacred depths of nature and the human soul, depths that, like a calm mountain lake, reflect exalted heights scraping the floor of heaven. While colossal companies spend colossal dollars on colossal data centers using colossal amounts of energy, the pilgrim soul walks quietly and confidently towards the future, guided by the inner light, knowing it is kindled and nourished by a divine mind possessed of a sovereign strength that could, if it so willed, crush like an ant the most powerful machine that ever has or will be built. You can, after all, read all about it in the Apocalypse of John. Read and think well which way you will walk and with whom you shall cast your lot. Meanwhile, meditate on this figure, which might have something to say about the coming age of spirit, new forms of the God within that are, like beauty itself, both ancient and ever new. Nike, winged victory, perched upon the prow of seafaring craft, returning from Salamis or Actium, your dramatic figure torqued lightly at the waist. The torso is human, even as the left wing opens and spreads wide like an eagle or angel's, as if the will that thrust you forward, that bears you swiftly on, were not the vessel's own, but God's speed. Who can deny the power of such beauty, or the beauty of such power? If the holy bodies torn upon the cross, here one may behold spirit, soul, and body balanced, three as one. Thank you.